Hear me out, partner, as I unfold a tale from wind-burned reaches of the frontier. Across the West, surprises kick harder than a bronc. Picture a weathered widower, grief heavy as iron, meeting a bold bride scorned for her size, stranded at a station. Steam sighs, cinders drift, and fate elbows two wandering hearts onto one track. Before sundown, vows are spoken fast as a draw sparking a fuse that burns through pride and peril. Tighten your cinch, square your shoulders, keep your eyes ahead. The trail bends mean stakes. Climb higher, and every mile tests their grit. This ride won't be gentle. Expect dust, danger, devotion before the last whistle fades. In the sweltering heat of August 1883, Jim Holay stepped down from a dust-choked stagecoach onto the streets of Dodge City, Kansas. The sun beat mercilessly upon the roofs and the boardwalks, the kind of heat that seemed to draw the strength out of a man and leave nothing but weariness behind. Jim carried little more than a battered saddlebag and the weight of his grief. His wife and child, buried by fever 2 winters past, had left him hollow. A widower, wandering from town to town, trading his labor for coin, drifting without destination. He had no reason to linger in Dodge. His plan was to earn a few dollars, find the next coach, and keep moving. Yet fate, as it often did on the frontier, had other designs. The train station was alive with commotion. Steam hissed, whistles blew, and the thunder of iron wheels rattled. The earth, as a newly arrived locomotive, shuddered to a stop. Passengers spilled onto the platform, families reunited in tearful embraces, gamblers swaggering toward saloons, cattle hands jostling for space. Amid the chaos, Jim's gaze fixed upon a solitary figure that stood apart from the bustle. She sat on a weather-worn trunk, her gown of deep purple catching the light in places where the fabric had been pressed smooth from travel. Her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world bore down upon them. Stray curls tumbled from her pinned hair, clinging damp to her flushed cheeks. The expression on her face was one of restrained panic, of someone abandoned in a strange land with no clear path forward. People glanced her way, some indifferent, some cruel. A few whispered behind gloved hands. Jim noticed the way her chin quivered as she tried to keep her composure. Against every instinct that told him to keep his distance, Jim found himself watching her. Something in her loneliness stirred an old ache in him, the part of himself he had tried to bury alongside his family. He took an uneasy step closer. Her name, he soon learned, was Clara Davenport. He overheard her strained words to the station master, voice trembling with both anger and despair. She clutched a crumpled envelope, its edges bent from travel. It contained the name of a man who was supposed to meet her. That man, it seemed, had caught one look at her when she stepped off the train, and without so much as a word had turned and vanished. Clara had traveled hundreds of miles to marry, answering a lonely rancher's advertisement for a wife, a practice not uncommon where men vastly outnumbered women. And yet, the one who had beckoned her west had decided in an instant that she was too big to be the partner he desired. Jim felt a surge of anger he hadn't expected. The frontier was harsh, and he had seen cruelty in every form. But to leave a woman stranded and humiliated at a train station went beyond the ordinary meanness of men. He thought of his late wife, how tender her heart had been, how fragile. Her feelings. He knew the sting of heartbreak cut deeper than any bullet wound. He found his feet moving before his mind had fully reckoned it. "Ma'am," he said gently, tipping his hat. "You look like you could use some help." Clara's wide brown eyes turned toward him, shimmering with unshed tears. She seemed wary, unsure if she should trust the stranger. But there was something steady in his gaze, something that promised he meant no harm. In halting words, she explained her plight, how she had left behind her life in Philadelphia, where she'd earned her living as a seamstress, and come west to start anew. Now she had nowhere to go, no money for return passage, and no welcome waiting for her here. Jim ran a hand through his sweat-damp hair, uncertain what possessed him to offer assistance. "I reckon you need a place to stay, at least for tonight," he said. The station master muttered about the local inn, though its last remaining rooms were crowded and prone to rowdy drifters. Jim hesitated, then offered, "There's a house near the edge of town, run by Mrs. Farnsworth. Decent woman. Might set you up fair." Clara looked at him long, searching for a sign of deceit. A gust of wind tugged loose her hair, tumbling curls about her cheeks. Behind the veil of vulnerability in her eyes, Jim glimpsed a quiet resilience, as though life's disappointments had forged a strength even she had not recognized yet. At last she swallowed, voice unsteady. "Thank you," she murmured. I came here to be wed. I don't know what happens next." Jim arranged for the station master to keep watch over her trunk, then guided Clara gently from the platform. The afternoon sun bore down as they walked in silence, dust rising with each step. They passed saloons where rough cattlemen lingered, their gazes following Clara with open curiosity. Some snickered, whispering cruel remarks. Jim's cold glare silenced the worst of them. She kept her head high, though he could see the tremor in her hands as she clutched her parasol. At last, they reached Farnsworth's boarding house. A modest two-story frame with chipped paint but a reputation for respectability. Mrs. Farnsworth, a plump, motherly woman in her 50s, greeted them at the door. She recognized Jim from past stays, raising her brows at his unexpected companion. Clara flushed, stammering out her name, Miss Davenport, her voice trembling at the memory of what had brought her here. Mrs. Farnsworth's perceptive eyes softened. She nodded firmly and promised Clara a clean room upstairs. Supper at 7. When Clara slipped inside, Jim lingered to explain the truth. She was abandoned, he said quietly. Mrs. Farnsworth shook her head in dismay. "Men can be cruel," she said. The words pierced Jim, reminding him of loss, of the way grief and cruelty could shape a life forever. That evening, instead of drowning his solitude in whiskey at the Long Branch Saloon, Jim found himself at Mrs. Farnsworth's dining table across from Clara. Venison stew, cornbread, peas from the garden. Clara ate with measured politeness, though her eyes betrayed a ravenous hunger. The silence between them was broken only by soft questions about her life in Philadelphia, about the advertisement that had lured her west. Her voice quavered as she admitted, "I thought in the West a woman of strong arms and sturdy build would be valued. I didn't expect to be dismissed at first sight." Jim frowned, swirling his stew. "No one deserves that," he said simply. Her eyes flickered with gratitude at the quiet kindness in his voice, and when he rose to leave, she caught his wrist. "You've shown me more kindness in a day than he ever did in all his letters." Outside, beneath the silvered light of the day, Moon, Jim lingered, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. His thoughts wrestled with the unsettling truth. In Clara's plight, he felt something stir, not just sympathy. Something older, deeper, a faint pulse in a limb long thought numb. He could not yet name it, but he knew he could not simply walk away. Dodge City had a way of swallowing men whole. The clang of spurs on the boardwalks, the sharp laughter spilling from saloon doors, the constant rattle of wagons life pressed forward without pause. Yet for Jim Holay, the days that followed felt unusually heavy, every moment colored by the image of Clara Davenport sitting alone on that trunk, abandoned and humiliated. He told himself he had no reason to stay. Still, when dawn broke and the cattlemen drifted into the stockyards, Jim found himself lingering. He picked up odd work at the livery, hauling water, mucking stalls, and repairing a warped fence rail. The coins jingled light in his pocket, but it wasn't money that kept him in Dodge. Each evening, his boots carried him back toward Farnsworth's boarding house, though he never admitted why. Something about Clara's quiet resilience tugged at him like a splinter beneath the skin, sharp and insistent. On the second evening, he returned to find her seated on the porch, a folded handkerchief in her lap. The heat had not relented. Sweat shone along her temples as she fanned herself with slow, deliberate motions. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for a figure that never came. When Jim approached, she straightened politely, offering him a weary smile. "Evenin'." "Miss Davenport," he said, tipping his hat. "Good evening, Mr. Holay." Her voice was softer than before, tinged with fatigue. "The town is loud, isn't it?" "Every sound feels like it rattles through your bones." Jim chuckled, leaning against the porch rail. "Noise like that, a man either gets used to it or—" He moves on. "I reckon you'll grow used to it in time." She lowered her gaze, the faintest shadow of doubt flickering across her face. "Perhaps. Though I cannot stay here forever. Mrs. Farnsworth has been kind, but I spent nearly all I had on the journey west." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a tremor. "I don't know what I'll do when the last coin is gone." The admission lodged heavy in Jim's chest. He thought of the envelope she had clutched. At the station, the cruel promise of a life that vanished before it began. He wanted to tell her she deserved more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he asked quietly, "You said you were a seamstress?" Clara nodded. "Yes, back east, I mended coats, stitched gowns, worked long hours with needle and thread. Perhaps I might do the same here, if anyone would have me." Jim's gaze drifted to the rough-hewn buildings lining the street. Dodge City was full of cowhands tearing their shirts in bar brawls, gamblers who couldn't keep their jackets in one piece, and families who needed clothing patched together to last another season. "There'll be work," he said finally. "Plenty of folks could. Use your skill. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her eyes lifted to meet his. For a fleeting moment, their gazes locked, an unspoken warmth passing between them before she looked away, clearing her throat. "You are kind to say so, Mr. Holay." That night, Jim tossed restlessly in his small rented room above the livery. Memories he had tried to bury clawed their way back, his wife's laughter, the soft curl of his daughter's hand around his finger, the fever that stole them both. He had sworn never to care again, never to risk the hollow ache of loss. Yet, here he was, drawn toward a woman who needed protecting. A stranger. And still he could not turn away. 2 more days passed in a blur. Clara kept busy with small tasks, hemming a skirt for Mrs. Farnsworth's niece, patching a sleeve for the blacksmith's wife. The coins she earned were barely enough to cover her board, but they gave her purpose. Jim, meanwhile, worked longer. Hours at the stable, his hands blistered from hauling feed and mending corral posts. He told himself it was only for a short while, only until he found his footing. But when the sun set, his steps always carried him back to the boarding house porch, where Clara often sat with her sewing in her lap. One evening, as dusk bled across the sky, a letter arrived bearing the seal of Philadelphia. Clara opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a brief note from her family, accompanied by a few folded bills. The words urged her to return home, to abandon what they called a foolish idea of forging a life in the West. Tears pricked at her eyes as she read aloud, her voice breaking. "They never believed in me," she whispered. "All they see is my weight, my hopeless dreams. But I cannot go back to them, tail tucked between my legs." Jim felt something tighten in his chest. Before he could stop himself, he reached out, taking her hand gently in his calloused palm. "Miss Davenport," he said quietly, "you didn't travel all this way to be turned around by one man's cruelty. You deserve better than that." Clara blinked, startled by the earnestness in his voice. "What are you saying?" He inhaled sharply, as though bracing for a blow. "I'm saying, maybe I can offer better." Her eyes widened, tears glimmering in the lantern light. But we hardly know each other. You're a widower. Aren't you? Don't you want more time?" "I've had time," Jin said, his tone rougher than intended. "And all it's done is leave me drifting. Truth is, you need a partner. So do I. 2 lonely souls stand a better chance together then." Apart, the world seemed to hush around them. Even the crickets paused, their chorus fading into silence. Clara's breath caught, her cheeks burning. I don't know what to say. Say we'll figure it out," Jin murmured. "Together." For a heartbeat, she only stared at him, searching his face for signs of jest or deception. Finding none, she exhaled a shaky breath, her lips trembling into a smile. "Are you sure?" "More sure than I've been of anything in a long while." By midday the following afternoon, Dodge City buzzed with scandal. Jim Holay and Clara Davenport stood before the county clerk's desk, their vows spoken in quiet, steady voices. Mrs. Farnsworth fussed over Clara's hair, arranging a borrowed lace shawl across her shoulders. The grizzled clerk raised a brow as he signed the certificate. "3rd wedding this week," he muttered. "Half don't last a month." But Jim's jaw tightened with resolve. He had no illusions about hardship, but he knew the path was right. When the moment came, Clara's voice trembled yet carried clear. "I do," she said, the words ringing like a bell through the small room. Jim echoed the vow, his tone firm, though ghosts still haunted him. They exchanged simple bands plain gold Jim had purchased that morning with nearly all his savings. The clerk pronounced them man and wife. Applause rippled through the small gathering, even from those who had once mocked Clara. Jim lifted her, borrowed veil, and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips. In that fleeting moment, the gossip, the train whistles, the long shadow of grief, all of it faded. What remained was fragile but true, a promise that whatever came, they would face it together. The wedding had been simple, almost hurried, yet word of it galloped through Dodge faster than any horse. By nightfall, whispers filled every saloon, every boarding-house parlor. The cattle hands joked that Jim Holay must have lost his senses. Some gamblers placed bets on how long the marriage would last, and more than one merchant's wife whispered cruel remarks about the bride who had been deemed unworthy only days before. Clara heard the murmurs when she passed along the street, but she held her chin high. Beside her, Jim's steady presence kept the worst of the cruelty at bay. They spent their first night as husband and wife in a cramped upstairs room at Mrs. Farnsworth's, furnished with nothing more than a narrow bed, a cracked wash basin, and a single oil lamp that flickered against the peeling wallpaper. Yet to Clara, the space felt like a palace. For the first time since stepping off the train, she was not alone. Her heart pounded as she folded her shawl carefully over the chair, the lace trembling in her hands. Jim busied himself unbuckling his belt, hanging his hat upon a nail, moving. With a quiet awkwardness that betrayed his nerves, neither spoke much that night. Words seemed clumsy against the enormity of what they had done. Instead, they lay side by side, shoulders barely touching, listening to the muffled laughter from the saloon across the street. Clara whispered a prayer of gratitude into the dark, while Jim stared at the ceiling, the memory of his lost family pressing heavy against the fragile hope blooming within him. The following morning, Jim resolved to face the town head-on. He led Clara down to the bustling market square, where wagons rattled and merchants hawked their goods. With most of his savings gone toward the rings and license, money was tight. Still, he bought her a length of sturdy calico fabric, insisting she sew herself a dress that would mark the beginning of her new life. Clara touched the cloth reverently, tears stinging her eyes at the simple gesture. They stopped at the blacksmith's stall, where Jim secured steady work repairing iron fittings and hauling coal. It was hard labor, but he welcomed it. Honest. Sweat kept his grief at bay. Clara, meanwhile, carried her needle and thread to the general store, asking politely if the proprietor might allow her to post a notice offering mending services. The man raised a skeptical brow, muttering that most women out here work kitchens or laundry. But Clara persisted, her voice steady. "Stitches last longer than stew," she told him. Against his better judgment, the proprietor agreed. By sundown, Clara had her first customer, a farm wife with torn hems and children too rough on their clothes. Word spread quickly. Within a week, Clara's hands were busy from dawn until nightfall, her lap covered in fabric scraps as she mended. Trousers, patched coats, and even altered dresses for the more fashionable ladies of Dodge. She charged modestly, careful not to overstep, but the coins she earned filled the small jar on the windowsill. Each clink of silver felt like a victory. Jim watched her in quiet admiration. There was a fire in her that no cruel whisper could quench. Where others saw only a woman judged for her size, he saw strength, skill, and courage. More than once, he found himself pausing at the doorway, simply to watch her bent over her needle, her brow furrowed in concentration, the lamplight painting her features with a gentle glow. Each time, the hollowness in his chest seemed to ease, yet not all welcomed their union. One evening, as Jim crossed the street to fetch water, a ranch hand named Tom Colley staggered out of the saloon, whiskey heavy on his breath. He sneered, blocking Jim's path. Heard you tied yourself to that seamstress, Collie drawled. Couldn't find a woman worth looking at, so you settled for what no one else wanted. Jim's jaw clenched. He knew better than to waste words on drunkards. But the insult burned hotter than any brand. Step aside, he said evenly. Collie smirked. Or what? You'll fight for her honor? Ain't worth the trouble. Jim's fist connected before the words had finished leaving the man's mouth. Collie crumpled to the dirt, stunned. Jim stood over him, chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding. Around them, onlookers froze. A silence stretched, broken only when Jim growled, Say one more word about my wife, and you'll be chewing dust the rest of your days. No one doubted he meant it. From that night forward, whispers persisted, but no man dared insult Clara. Within earshot of Jim Holay, Clara, when she heard of it, pressed trembling fingers to his bruised hand. You didn't have to fight, she whispered. You'll only give them more reason to talk. I don't give a damn what they talk about, Jim replied. But I won't stand by and let them spit on you. Not while I've got breath left in me. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. She said nothing more, only squeezed his hand tight. In that grip, Jim felt a vow stronger than any spoken aloud. As September waned, life began to take shape. They moved from Mrs. Farnsworth's boarding house to a modest rented cabin near the edge of town. It was small, 2 rooms, a leaky roof, and a hearth that smoked more than it warmed, but it was theirs. Clara stitched curtains from spare fabric, brightening the windows with cheerful patterns. Jim built her a sewing table from leftover planks, sanding it smooth until her fingers could glide across without a splinter. Slowly, the cabin filled with life, the smell of stew simmering, the sound of fabric tearing and being reborn, the warmth of laughter that had been absent from both their lives for far too long. One evening, as autumn's chill crept through the cracks, Jim returned home weary but smiling, carrying a bundle beneath his arm. Clara unwrapped it to find a second-hand Bible, its cover worn but intact. Every home needs one, he said simply. She traced her fingers over the pages, her heart swelling. Together they read aloud by lamplight, their voices blending softly. In the quiet night, for Clara, it was proof that she was no longer forgotten. For Jim, it was a reminder that even from the ashes of loss, new beginnings could take root. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that their hasty vows had kindled something fragile but real. Love, like a seed, had been planted in the dew, most unlikely soil. Now it waited, hidden beneath the surface, for time and trial to test whether it would wither or grow strong enough to weather every storm. Autumn pressed hard upon Dodge City, the prairie winds sharpening with each passing day. The leaves along the sparse cottonwoods browned and fell, swirling through the streets like scraps of forgotten paper. For Jim and Clara, the days slipped into a rhythm: hard work, modest meals, small kindnesses that stitched together a fragile semblance of home. Clara's sewing gained steady recognition. Ranchers' wives brought her torn skirts, drovers brought ripped coats, and even a few saloon girls whispered requests for alterations, slipping coins into her palm with conspiratorial smiles. Each clink of silver in her jar swelled her pride. For the first time in her life, she was wanted for her skill, not judged for her appearance. Jim, too, found steady footing at the blacksmith's, his hands blackened by soot and his back sore each night. He came home smelling of iron and sweat. But Clara never complained. She met him with a basin of water, a towel, and often a bowl of stew waiting on the hearth. Slowly, without fanfare, the two of them built something neither had expected, a life intertwined. But the frontier was never gentle. One morning, Jim woke to find Clara bent over the sewing table, a line of fabric stretched taut as she patched a child's jacket. She smiled when he entered, but her face was pale, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. He frowned. "You worked half the night again," he said. She shrugged softly. "There's more demand than I expected. Every stitch is a coin we need." Jim placed a calloused hand over hers, halting the needle. "We'll manage. Don't drive yourself into the ground." Her lips trembled into a smile, touched by his concern. But in her heart, Clara feared that if she faltered, if she failed to prove her worth, the whispers that haunted her would return louder than ever. She pressed on, determined to shoulder more than her share. The whispers had not faded entirely. At the mercantile, two women Clara had altered dresses for spoke in hushed tones, assuming she was out of earshot. "Still can't believe Holay married her, a seamstress of all things. Desperate men do desperate things. Won't last past. Spring, you'll see." Clara's cheeks burned as she hurried from the store. That night, as she stirred stew over the fire, her voice broke. "They say you made a mistake, Jim, that you should have chosen someone prettier, someone finer." Jim paused in the doorway, his shirt half unbuttoned, his eyes steady on her trembling back. He stepped close, resting his rough hands upon her shoulders. "I didn't choose a pretty face. I chose a strong heart. I chose you. Let them talk. Doesn't matter one damn bit to me." Tears pricked her eyes as she leaned against him. In that moment, the sting of cruel words dulled, though it never fully vanished. As winter crept in, money thinned. The blacksmith's work slowed with the cold, and fewer customers came for sewing. Their meals grew simpler: beans, bread, the occasional rabbit Jim managed to snare on the prairie. Clara patched blankets to keep the draft at bay, her fingers aching from constant stitching. Yet through the hardship, they laughed often, trading stories late into the night by the glow of the hearth. One stormy evening, as wind howled and snow lashed the shutters, Jim pulled from beneath the bed a small wooden box. Clara watched curiously as he set it upon the table. Inside lay keepsakes, his late wife's hair ribbon, a tiny shoe once worn by his daughter, a faded photograph of 3 smiling faces. His voice was low, unsteady. "I've carried this burden alone too long," he admitted. "But if we're truly to share a life, you ought to know the ghosts I carry." Clara's heart ached as she traced the ribbon with trembling fingers. She did not flinch or turn away. Instead, she closed the box gently, then placed her hand over his. "Your past does not frighten me, Jim. It's what made you the man you are, the man who saved me when no one else would. I will carry those ghosts with you if you'll let me." Jim's throat tightened, words failing him. Instead, he kissed her forehead with a tenderness he had not allowed himself in years. For the first time, the ache of loss lessened, not because it was forgotten, but because it was shared. Yet hardship was never far. Early in December, news reached Dodge that rustlers had been raiding ranches along the Arkansas River, driving off cattle and leaving barns in ruin. Tension thickened in town. Men gathered in saloons, voices raised in anger over lost stock. The Sheriff urged calm, but fear not at every rancher. One evening, as Jim returned from work, he found Clara waiting with a troubled expression. "Mrs. Farnsworth stopped by," she said. "She warned me to be careful. She says when times get hard, people look for scapegoats, outsiders, women who don't fit." Jim's jaw tightened. "If anyone so much as breathes wrong at you, they'll answer to me." But Clara's worry deepened. She had seen how quickly kindness soured in the eyes of others. She prayed silently each night that their fragile peace would hold that Christmas passed quietly in their little cabin. With no money for gifts, they exchanged handmade tokens. Clara sewed Jim a warm scarf of patched wool, while Jim carved her a wooden thimble holder in the shape of a heart. They shared a meal of venison stew, courtesy of a neighbor, and read aloud from the Bible until the fire died low. Clara whispered that it was the happiest Christmas she had ever known. Jim, though he said little, felt a warmth stir deep in his chest that he had thought forever lost. Snow blanketed the prairie into January, muffling the land in silence. The world beyond their cabin seemed hushed, waiting. Jim and Clara clung to one another through the long winter nights, unaware that spring would bring storms far fiercer than snowstorms that would test not only their marriage, but their very survival. Spring came late to the prairie that year. Snow melted into slush, then into thick mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels alike. The Arkansas River swelled with runoff, spilling its banks in places, leaving wide patches of soggy land where cattle once grazed. Yet with the thaw came fresh life, green shoots pushing through the earth, meadowlarks returning with their bright song, and the promise of a new season. For Jim and Clara, the first weeks of spring carried a fragile sense of hope. Clara's sewing continued to bring steady customers, and Jim took on more blacksmith work as the ranchers repaired their gear for the busy season ahead. Their little cabin, though modest, felt brighter with the curtains open and the hearth less burdened by constant fire. Clara even planted a small garden patch behind the house, kneeling in the damp soil with determination. "Carrots, beans, and squash," she said. "We'll have something of our own come harvest." Jim watched her from the porch, pride tugging at his chest, but shadows lengthened quickly. Rustler raids, once whispers, turned into brazen strikes. Ranchers rode into town with fury etched across their faces, demanding the sheriff raise a posse. Dozens of cattle were missing, barns burned, and a few men had been left bloodied in their wake. The name whispered among the townsfolk was Ike Dobbs, a notorious drifter turned outlaw, leading a band of cutthroats who prowled the plains like wolves. One evening, as Jim walked Clara home from the market, a commotion broke near the saloon. A group of ranchers, half drunk and fully angry, argued with the sheriff in the street. "You're sitting on your hands while Dobbs steals us blind," one man shouted. "If you won't act, we damn well will." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "I'll not send men into the prairie half-cocked and get them killed. We'll handle Dobbs proper." But the crowd wasn't soothed. Jim felt Clara's hand tighten around his arm, her voice a whisper. "Jim, what if they come here?" He glanced at her, saw the fear in her eyes. "If they do," he said evenly, "they'll regret it." The raids crept closer. Smoke on. The horizon one morning revealed a ranch just 10 miles south had been torched. Jim returned late that night from the blacksmith's, his face drawn. his knuckles raw from hammering iron into makeshift locks and bars for fearful ranchers. Clara met him at the door, worry etched deep in her brow. "You can't get involved." "Jim," she said, "not with men like Dobbs. Promise me." Jim set down his tools, his shoulders heavy. "Clara, men like Dobbs don't stop until they're stopped. Sheriff's dragging his feet. If he calls for volunteers, I have to answer." Her voice cracked. "And what if you don't come back? I only just found you. I can't lose you now." Jim cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I swore when I married you I'd stand by you, protect you. That hasn't changed. But sometimes protecting means standing tall, not hiding." Clara wanted to protest, but she saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had driven him to defend her honor in the street, that had carried him through grief and loss. She swallowed her fear, knowing there were battles a wife could not win for her husband. The call came sooner than expected. By mid-April, the sheriff finally raised a posse, and Jim was among the first to volunteer. He spent the night before sharpening his old revolver, oiling the leather of his holster, and packing what few supplies he had. Clara sat nearby, her needle trembling in her hand as she patched his worn coat. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the scrape of whetstone against steel dot. At last, Clara set aside her sewing. She crossed the room, kneeling beside him. "If you must go," she whispered, "take this." From her pocket, she pressed a small silver thimble into his palm, the same one Jim had carved a holder for at Christmas. "A piece of me to bring you back safe." Jim's throat tightened. He closed his fingers over the token, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I'll come back to you, always." The posse rode out at dawn, 12 men strong. Clara stood on the porch, watching until the dust of their horses faded into the horizon. Alone, she wrapped her shawl tighter, praying with all her might. Days passed with no word. She filled the silence with work, mending and sewing until her fingers bled, the rhythmic pull of needle and thread the only thing keeping her fears at bay. On the 5th night, a knock rattled the cabin door. Clara's heart leapt, but it wasn't Jim. Instead, a wounded rancher stumbled inside, bandaged and weary. He spoke of an ambush Dobbs, and his men had lured the posse into a canyon, shots ringing from hidden ridges. Several men were dead. The survivors scattered, each fleeing for his life. Clara's knees gave way. "And Jim?" she demanded. The rancher shook his head. "Didn't see him after the first volley. God help him." The room spun. Clara clutched the edge of the table, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silver thimble's holder lay on the shelf, gleaming in the lamplight. She pressed it to her lips, whispering fiercely into the silence, "Come back to me, Jim Holay. Please, come back." Miles away, in the ravine where the ambush had erupted, Jim lay belly down in the dirt, blood seeping from a crease along his shoulder. His revolver was hot in his hand, smoke rising from its barrel. The night pressed cold and merciless around him. Dobbs's men prowled somewhere in the dark, their laughter echoing like wolves. But Jim was alive. And as he pressed the thimble tight in his fist, Clara's face burned bright in his mind, stronger than fear, stronger than pain. He gritted his teeth, whispered a prayer, and prepared to fight his way home. The canyon reeked of gunpowder and dust. The posse had been torn apart, men scattering like leaves in a gale, but Jim Holay was not one to scatter. Pressed against the jagged stone, his breath shallow, he gritted his teeth against the stinging. His shoulder. Blood seeped hot through his torn coat, sticky against the dirt. Still, he clutched his revolver in one hand and the silver thimble in the other, Clara's voice echoing in his mind. "Come back to me, dot above," Ike Dobbs's men prowled. The ridges, their silhouettes sharp against the moonlight. A cruel laugh rang out. "Ain't no use hidin', Holay. We know you're down there. Might as well come up and meet your end proper." Jim's jaw tightened. He had heard of Dobbs' ruthless, cunning, a man who'd sold his soul for blood and cattle. Now the outlaw's shadow loomed larger than life, his men tightening the noose. But Jim was no greenhorn. He'd ridden with cattle drives across Comanche country, fought through blizzards and drought. He knew survival meant patience as much as bullets. A rustler crept too close, boots crunching on shale. Jim waited, breath steady, then fired once. The man crumpled, his rifle clattering down the rocks. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire, echoes bouncing wild off canyon walls. Jim rolled behind a boulder, reloading with shaking fingers. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for Clara. Back in Dodge, Clara lived every hour in torment. Each creak of the cabin door, each hoofbeat on the street made her heart lurch. Days stretched into a week, her prayers growing hoarse, her hands raw from sewing just to keep busy. Every evening, she lit the oil lamp and placed it in the window, a beacon against the dark, whispering, "Come home, Jim. Find your way back." The townsfolk whispered to some saying Holay was surely dead, others muttering that Clara had cursed at him with her misfortune. She bore it all in silence, though at night she wept into the pillow, clutching the thimble holder like it was his very hand. Then, on the 9th night, as a storm gathered over the plains, a figure staggered into Dodge, leaning on his rifle as a crutch. Clothes torn and caked in blood, Jim Holay appeared like a ghost risen from the earth. Clara was at the door before he even reached the porch, her cry piercing the thunder. "Jim!" He collapsed into her arms, weary but alive, the silver thimble still clenched in his palm. For 3 days, Clara tended his wounds. She boiled water, changed bandages, fed him broth with trembling hands. Jim, feverish, drifted in and out of sleep, mumbling fragments of the fight, the ambush, the canyon walls, Dobbs's men circling like wolves. Each time he woke, Clara was there, smoothing his brow, whispering prayers of thanks that he had come. Back at All Dot, when at last his strength began to return, Jim spoke plainly. "Dobbs is still out there. I wounded him, but not enough. He'll come back meaner than before." Clara shook her head fiercely. "No, Jim, let the sheriff handle it. You've already given enough." But Jim knew the sheriff's limits. Men like Dobbs thrived on hesitation, and every rancher in the territory lived in fear until he was dealt with. Jim could not abide letting evil roam unchecked, not when it threatened all they had built. Still, he said nothing more for the moment. He simply held Clara's hand, promising silently that no outlaw would take away what they had fought so hard to claim Dot by late May. Jim was strong enough to return to work, though his shoulder carried a permanent ache. Clara insisted he pace himself, but Jim pressed on. The town eyed him with newfound respect. He was one of the few survivors of Dobbs's ambush, a man who had faced death and crawled back alive. But Dobbs's shadow lingered. Cattle thefts slowed, but whispers claimed the outlaw was regrouping, gathering more men across the river. Some believed he had sworn vengeance against the one who had shot him. If that were true, Jim Holay knew his days of peace were numbered. One evening, as Clara prepared supper, Jim stepped outside and watched the prairie darken beneath the setting sun. The horizon stretched endless, beautiful, yet heavy with threat. Clara joined him on the porch, slipping her hand into his. "Do you ever wish," she asked softly, "that we had chosen somewhere quieter? Somewhere safer?" Jim shook his head. "The prairie's cruel, Clara, but it's honest. We can make a life here if we're willing to fight for it." Her eyes glistened in the fading light. "Then I'll fight beside you." Jim looked at her, truly looked, the woman once dismissed as plain, who had become the anchor of his battered soul. He bent, kissed her softly, and whispered, "That's all I need." But Ike Dobbs was not finished that far to the south. In a hidden camp among the cottonwoods, Dobbs nursed his wounded arm, rage burning hotter than fever. The bullet Holay had left in him was a scar he would carry forever, a reminder that no man could make a fool of Ike Dobbs and live. He spat into the fire, snarling to his gathered men. "Holay thinks he's safe, thinks he can play husband and blacksmith and forget he crossed me. But I'll burn his world down, piece by piece. I'll take his cattle, his cabin hell, I'll take his woman if I please. And when he watches it all fall, then I'll put him in the ground." The men laughed darkly, emboldened by their leader's fury. The storm was gathering, and soon Jim and Clara Holay would find themselves at the heart of it. The first sign came with silence. One evening in early June, Clara stepped outside to draw water. The prairie stretched wide and calm, but something felt wrong. The meadowlarks were quiet, the usual chorus of frogs by the river oddly hushed. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though the land itself held its breath. She returned to the cabin with the pail, unease prickling at her skin. That night, Jim lay awake, listening. Beyond the crackle of the hearth, he heard it faintly hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, circling the edge of town. He rose quietly, checked the revolver at his bedside, and peered through the curtain. In the moonlight, a rider lingered on the ridge, watching. Then, as if satisfied, the figure turned and vanished into the dark. "It's Dobbs," Jim muttered, his jaw tight. "He's testing us." Clara shivered, clutching her shawl. "What will he do?" "Whatever it takes to make me break," Jim replied. "But he'll find out I don't scare easy." The very next morning, a fire was spotted on the north side of town. By the time men arrived, the barn of a local rancher lay in ashes, cattle scattered. Tracks showed a band of riders had driven the herd off under cover of night. Though no one was hurt, fear swept through Dodge. All eyes turned toward Jim Holay, the man Dobbs had sworn vengeance against down at the saloon. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Dobbs is baiting him out, wants Holay to come alone. Mark my words, he'll strike at that seamstress next." The words cut Clara when she overheard them, but Jim stood tall, refusing to show fear. That evening, Sheriff Turner stopped by their cabin. He was a weary man, worn by too many battles and not enough victories. "Holay," he said, You know Dobbs won't stop till he's satisfied, but don't go playing hero. Let me and my men deal with him." Jim folded his arms. "With respect, Sheriff, you had 12 men in that canyon, and near half never came home. Dobbs isn't a problem you can chase off with talk." Turner's eyes hardened. "And if you go after him yourself, you'll just give him what he wants, a body in the dirt. You've got a wife now. Think on that." Jim didn't answer. But long after the sheriff left, Clara found him sitting on the porch, staring at the horizon, the revolver heavy in his hand. Dobbs struck again a week later, bolder this time. In broad daylight, his men rode through a ranch 2 miles south, firing shots in the air, laughing as they drove off horses. One farmhand was beaten half to death for refusing to hand over supplies. The message was clear. No one was safe, least of all Jim Holay. That night, Clara confronted him. Her eyes were fierce, her hands trembling as she spoke. "Jim, if you go after him, you'll die. And if you die, what becomes of me? What becomes of everything we've built?" Jim's gaze softened, but his voice was steady. "Clara, listen to me. Dobbs doesn't just want cattle or coin. He wants fear. If I do nothing, he wins. And when he wins, men like him never stop. Not with you, not with me, not with anyone in this town." Clara's voice broke. "And what if I lose you?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he could shield her from the very air. "You won't, I swear it." But deep down, he knew there were no guarantees on the frontier. Only choices. 2 nights later, Dobbs made his move. Clara was mending by lamplight when the sound of hooves thundered near. Shouts followed, men hollering, dogs barking, then the sharp crack of a gunshot. Jim snatched his revolver, pulled Clara to the floor as glass shattered from the window. Bullets tore through the cabin walls, splinters flying. "Down!" Jim barked, returning fire through the broken glass. A rustler cried out, tumbling from his horse. Chaos roared outside, gunfire and hoofbeats circling the cabin like a pack of wolves. Clara clutched the Bible against her chest, whispering prayers as Jim fired, reloaded, fired again. Shadows danced across the walls, the night alive with violence. Then came a voice, deep, mocking, cruel. "Holay, you still breathin' in there? Thought I left you for buzzards in that canyon. Come on out, and maybe I'll let your woman live to see another day." Clara's blood ran cold. Jim's eyes burned like steel. He leaned close to her, whispering, "Stay low. Don't move till I say." Then, gripping the silver thimble tight, he rose and shouted through the shattered window, "Dobbs, you want me? Come and get me." The outlaw's laughter rolled across the prairie, gladly. The gunfire ceased for a moment, replaced by the eerie silence of men closing in. Jim knew this was no random raid. This was the showdown Dobbs had promised. And before the night ended, either Jim Holay or Ike Dobbs would be buried in the Kansas dirt. Gunfire shattered the Kansas night. Bullets tore splinters from the cabin walls, lamps toppled, smoke filled the room. Clara huddled low, clutching her shawl, while Jim fired steady, each shot deliberate, each breath measured dot outside Dobbs's. Men whooped and hollered, circling on horseback, loosing wild shots meant to terrify. But terror was wasted on Jim Holay. He had stared down grief, buried his family, and clawed back from a canyon ambush. He was not a man who scared easy. Holay. Dobbs's voice boomed again, thick with hatred. Come out or I'll light that shack and roast you alive. Jim's jaw hardened. He glanced at Clara, pale in the flickering light. Stay here, he whispered, pressing the silver thimble into her hand. No matter what, keep it close. Her eyes brimmed with tears. Jim, please don't go. He kissed her quickly, fiercely, then rose, revolver in hand. I'll end this. Jim kicked open the door, the night exploding around him. Muzzle flashes lit the prairie, thunderous hooves churned the dirt. He fired twice, dropping one rustler. Clean off his saddle. Another rushed him. Jim dove aside, rolling, sending a bullet straight through the man's chest. Dobbs's laughter cut through the chaos. There's the blacksmith. Knew you'd come crawling out. From the shadows, Ike Dobbs emerged astride a black stallion, his arm still bound from Jim's canyon shot. His eyes burned under the brim of his hat, teeth bared in a predator's grin. This time, Holay, you won't walk away. The two locked eyes, one outlaw, one widower turned fighter. The battle wasn't just about cattle or vengeance. It was about proving which man would own the prairie night. Then stop talking, Jim growled. Chaos erupted. Rustlers swarmed, their pistols flashing. Jim ducked behind a trough, firing back, picking them off one by one. Townsfolk, roused by the noise, began to emerge with rifles. Ranchers, shopkeepers, even the sheriff himself. Shots cracked from porches, windows, rooftops. The townsfolk had had enough of Ike Dobbs. Clara, heart-hammering, crawled to the shattered window, clutching the old rifle Jim kept above the mantel. Though her hands shook, she braced the barrel and fired into the dark. A rustler spun from his horse, his scream fading into silence. The tide began to turn. Dobbs saw it too. Fury twisted his face. He spurred his stallion forward, charging straight at Jim. With a roar, he leapt from the saddle, tackling Holay into the dirt. Guns scattered, fists and fury took over. The two men rolled in the dust, grappling, striking, blood mixing with sweat. Dobbs's strength was savage, fueled by rage. But Jim's was steady, forged in loss, driven by love. Each punch Dobbs landed, Jim answered with 2 at last. They broke apart, both staggering to their feet. The crowd of townsfolk pressed in. Gunfire still raging at the edges, but all eyes locked on the duel at the center. Dobbs spat blood, sneering. You think you're a hero, Holay? You're nothing but a broken man clinging to a plain woman. Jim's chest heaved, his eyes blazing. That plain woman is worth more than you and every one of your cutthroats put together. The words cut sharper than any blade. With a snarl, Dobbs drew a knife, lunging. Jim twisted, pain searing his wounded shoulder, but caught Dobbs's wrist. The knife hovered inches from his throat, Dobbs straining, snarling, desperate, and then crack. A single rifle shot split the night. Dobbs stiffened, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. He staggered back, knife slipping from his grip. His gaze flicked toward the cabin window where Clara stood, smoke curling from the rifle barrel. She had fired true. Dobbs swayed, tried to curse, then collapsed into the dust. The battlefield stilled. Rustlers, seeing their leader fall, broke into panic. Some fled into the dark, others dropped their weapons and begged for mercy. The sheriff and townsfolk surged forward, rounding them up. The air reeked of smoke and fear, the cries of wounded. Men mingling with the whinny of frightened horses. Jim bent, chest heaving, sweat streaking his dust-caked face. His eyes found Clara in the window, trembling, the rifle still in her hands. Slowly he rose, staggering toward her. When he reached the cabin steps, Clara ran to him, tears streaming, arms thrown around his neck. He winced at the pain in his shoulder, but held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "You saved me," he whispered hoarsely. She shook her head, sobbing. "No, Jim, we saved each other." By dawn, the prairie was quiet again. Dobbs's body lay outside town, a warning to all who might follow. His men were either in chains or scattered to the winds. For the first time in months, Dodge breathed easier. Jim and Clara stood together on the porch, watching the sunrise burn gold across the horizon. His arm was bandaged, her hands still shaking, but their hearts were steady. The storm had passed, and they had weathered it side by side. Clara squeezed his hand, her voice soft but unshakable. "We made it." Jim looked down at her, the woman the world had dismissed, the woman who had proven braver than any outlaw. He kissed her forehead, whispering, "Ain't a force on this earth can take us down, not while we've got each other." And as the sun rose high, painting the plains in fire and promise, their future stretched before them, uncertain, untamed, but theirs. Dawn thinned the smoke into blue wisps and left the prairie quiet as a church. Sheriff Turner finished tying the last of Dobbs's men to a wagon and lifted 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. "We'll see to the rest," he rasped. "Go on, and get some sleep." Jim and Clara stood in the doorway a moment, ribs aching from the night's terror, ears ringing with echoes of gunfire. Inside, the lamp guttered, a skillet sat cold on the hearth, and a single cup lay on its side where the first bullet had toppled it. Clara righted the cup, set the lamp steady, and put water on to boil. Small gestures, but they steadied the room, and the room steadied them. They didn't try to tell the story to each other. Words would come later. For now there was washing to do, blood to scrub from Jim's sleeve, splinters to pick from Clara's. Hands, a floor to sweep so new footprints didn't walk through the ashes of the old. When the kettle sang, Clara poured tea and pressed a tin mug into Jim's hand. He drank with his eyes shut and let the heat unclench the last of the night. From his bones dot by noon, people began to knock. Mrs. Farnsworth arrived with a loaf still warm from the oven and a scolding for Jim to sit down. The blacksmith's wife brought a jar of honey. Young Ben from the livery left a sack of oats for the mare that didn't bolt. Even the storekeeper, who once doubted a seamstress could make her way, tacked a placard in his window. Holay. Stitching and repairs fair. Fast. Reliable. Clara stared at it as if a stranger had spoken her true name aloud. The days that followed were not easy, but they were different. Men who had watched Dobbs from behind shutters now helped the sheriff ride the outskirts at dusk. Neighbors repaired fences together instead of alone. Boys who had practiced quick draws behind the saloon learned to swing hammers on a church roof. Jim returned to the forge in the mornings, shoeing horses, setting wagon tires, reforging hinges, and in the afternoons he took on quiet work others overlooked, tightening a stove door, straightening a plowshare, fixing a latch so a widow could sleep without fear. Clara stitched through it all. Her hands never hurried, yet no one waited long. She turned frayed cuffs into neat edges, let out seams without scolding, and salvaged dresses that mattered for a Sunday a girl had set her heart on. "You don't hide a life in the back of a closet," she told one anxious mother. "You mend it, press it, and let it see daylight." The woman left smiling, and the story spread until it reached places Clara had never seen. One afternoon, a lady from Topeka stepped off the noon train with a lace bodice, yellowed with years. "It was my mother's," she said. "Can you make?" "It fit me?" Clara touched the fabric like a memory and promised to try. 2 days later, the woman returned, put the dress on in the back room, and looked into the mirror with her hand over her mouth. "You've given her back to me," she whispered, and pressed extra bills into Clara's palm. Not every gift fit inside a purse. Near sundown, a boy of 8 trudged up to the porch with dust to his knees and a sack in both hands. "Ma says." "Thank you," he told Jim, thrusting the sack forward. Dried apples rattled inside. "You fixed our axle and wouldn't take pay. She says nobody eats pride." He glanced up at the new board over the door. "I like your sign." The sign had been Jim's labor. He planed a scrap of oak until the grain shone like water, then painted the letters with a brush made from horsehair, Holay and Holay Forge, and Stitch. Clara laughed the first time she saw it, a surprised, bubbling sound she never dared back east. "It looks near as fine as a lawyer's shingle," she teased. "Better," Jim said. "Lawyers don't fix much that's broken." Summer found them saving. Coins went into a coffee tin at day's end, each counted twice. They spoke of the bend in the river west of town where cottonwoods cast shade at noon and the soil darkened after rain. "Good water," Jim said, sketching. "A map in the dust with a nail. Room for a garden, a corral. 2 cows, maybe 3 if the grass holds." Clara added lists in the margin seed, a churn, a better kettle. Nails, then underlined curtains, as if a house wasn't finished without them. They moved in the first cool week of autumn. Neighbors came with wagons and good humor. Even the sheriff drove a load of boards. Jim set posts, raised rafters, laid planks. Clara stitched curtains between trips with the wheelbarrow and set the Bible on a crate like a promise. When the door finally swung true and the roof kept the first rain, Jim carved a date into the lintel with his knife. "So we remember we didn't just end a fight," he said. "We started something. They started a garden too." Clara turned the soil until it loosed the scent of iron and roots. Jim sank a fence corner true, strung wire, and hammered staples, until the rhythm steadied his shoulders' old ache. A girl came for a ribbon on credit and left with the ribbon paid by mending. A rancher brought Jim a busted stirrup and left with a hinge fixed on his chuck box, because I was there anyway. The land paid in kind. Quail nested near the fence. Beans climbed a twine ladder. A calf bawled until it learned the bucket. Meant milk. One evening, with chores softening into twilight, Clara asked quietly, "Do you ever regret how quick we said yes?" Jim slid an arm around her shoulders. The night smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. "Every good thing since came from that yes," he said. Then, after a pause, "The river bend might hold more than a forge and a sewing table come spring. Maybe a cradle, if God's willing." Clara's breath caught, not with fear now, but with that deeper courage that grows when a home proves itself sturdy. She didn't answer in words. She laced her fingers through his, and together they listened to the crickets swell. A train whistle drifted thin as thread. A coyote called. And beneath a sign naming what their hands had built, a lamp burned steady against the dark. If the prairie had one lesson left, it was this: love, stitched through hardship, wears like the strongest cloth. It doesn't pretend the world is gentle. It simply holds. And so, dear friends, our tale draws to a close. Jim Holay, once a weary widower, discovered not just survival on the Kansas plains, but the rare kind of love that heals wounds deeper than bullets. Clara Holay, once dismissed by cruel whispers, rose proud and unshakable, proving that true beauty shines brightest in courage and compassion. Together, they built a life from dust and danger, outlasting outlaws and outpacing despair. Their journey reminds us that in the untamed frontier, strength is born from loyalty, and real love is forged in fire. If this story touched your spirit, don't ride off too quick. Hit that like button, share this tale with kindred souls who love triumph over trial, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of grit, romance, and frontier justice.